Well, hello and welcome to the Sacred Path School podcast number 5, Why Good People Do Bad Things. All right, so if you remember the last podcast, if you listen to the last podcast, so number 4, which was The Wonderful World of Ethics, so we finished off basically looking at how some of the things like those 3 things, so contact versus no contact, personal versus impersonal, and history matters, how it basically mucks up your rational, logical thinking with regard to ethical issues. And remember that I said in this podcast, we're going to look at why good people do bad things. All right, so some of the key concepts we're going to cover in this podcast. Just to retouch on some of the normative ethical theory versus reality. So get that distinction between, okay, here's theory, but what actually happens in reality. Have a look at ethical decision making again. Question whether or not the theory is flawed. Have a look at good people or bad people. So how do you determine if somebody's good or bad, right? Have a look at the interdisciplinary theory and then the causal factor model explaining why good people do bad things. And the last bit is moral intention theory. So if you followed my work, you're aware that this was the subject of my PhD, my Doctor of Philosophy research that I did. When was that? So started 2012, I think, finished in 2016. So basically where I got to with it is I had been teaching ethics for around about, I don't know, probably 25 years, something like that, like a long time anyway. And I started to question whether or not what we were doing actually made any difference, which didn't impress the professors I was working with anyway. Anyway, so I started doing a PhD on asking that question. So does ethics, education and training actually make any difference? And very, very quickly, within about 30 odd years, within about 3 months, I found 30 odd years of research that basically shows that ethics education makes little or no difference. So I was asking the question far out, what is actually going on here? Is the theory flawed or is the way we're teaching it flawed? And then the second question that I was asking, which was critical, was, okay, I can understand why bad people do bad things. You know, so somebody has bad intent, but why do good people, or how do good people end up doing bad things? So how do people that are really, you know, well-respected community and family members, how do they end up presiding over, you know, fraud or something like that? Or, you know, what happens in the sporting arena? So, for example, the captain of the Australian cricket team, Steve Smith, ended up presiding over a ball tampering scandal, so basically a cheating scandal. So how does that actually happen? In business also, there's lots and lots of examples of like really well-respected people that get caught up in insider trading scandals and things like that. So my question was like, why do good people do bad things? Okay, so let's just get stuck into it. So if you remember, if we go back to the theory versus reality, so if you remember in the last podcast, so podcast number 4, I was looking at theory and I said to you that it's worthwhile exploring normative ethics theory. So normative ethics theory is asking that question of how ought we to live, or how do you lead a good life? And what I said is you can break that key question down into those 3 feeder questions. So what's right? So what's right and wrong in terms of values and principles? What's good in terms of outcomes, and what's fitting in terms of culture and context. And with regard to the each of those 3 areas, there's a variety of normative ethical theories that fit underneath those 3 questions. So for example, under the right-wrong question is divine command theory. I went through all this last time, so I won't go through it in detail, but divine command theory, which basically says that if you're religious or spiritual in any way, then there'll be a set of rules or guidelines to follow to lead a good life. Kant, remember Kant, German school teacher, 1860s, universalism, so he's looking for rules that are applicable in every situation. Aristotle, virtue ethics, so if you want to be virtuous, live the virtues, enact the virtues. The what's good stuff relates to outcomes. So this is utilitarian thinking. So this is very much sort of empire building, industrial revolution times in England. And then the what's fitting question is culture and context, so ethical relativism. So that's the theory. And there's other theories as well. There's distributive justice. There's female ethics, Taoist ethics, etc., etc. But all of them are basically fit under one of those three questions: what's right, what's good, what's fitting. And then remember that the ethical decision-making theory that I suppose kind of underpins that is the Jones moral intensity model, so related back to 1991. And really that's underpinned the majority of the ethics research that's been done over the last 30 years. And that model basically says that what happens is, one, you recognise the moral issue. So two, you make a moral judgment. So using one or a combination of those different normative ethical theories, you make a moral judgment. You establish moral intent, and then you engage in moral behaviour. And the moral intensity box, if you like, in that is basically saying that you're going to pay more attention to a big issue than a small one. So you're going to pay more attention to, a $5 million fraud than stealing off a stationery. Okay, so we talk quite a lot about in this podcast and the work that I do around looking at these theories and saying, well, what are the assumptions that underpin the theories? Okay, so what are the assumptions that you're making that basically is forming the foundation that you're then building this stuff on? And so with that theory of ethical decision making, there's two fundamental assumptions, and these are really, really important because remember I started doing PhD. Questioning doesn't make any difference, so research says makes no difference or very little difference. So then the question is, okay, is the theory flawed, right? Or is the way that we're teaching it flawed? And my proposition to you, if you like, is that the theory is flawed, right? So when you're looking at the theory, you want to dig into it and say, well, what about the theory is flawed? What are the assumptions that it's based on? So this ethical decision-making theory is based on these two fundamental assumptions. So one, that ethical decision-making is a rational, cognitive process that can be taught, okay? So that you can teach people how to do this and that it's rational, logical, basically it's happening in the brain, okay? And two, that unethical behaviour occurs due to one of these three things. So greed, poor character, or bad values, right? So the conclusion that you come to is that bad people do bad things, right? So bad people do bad things. So if you're faced with an ethical, what do you want to call it, sort of scandal or dilemma or something like that, so a big issue, like for example, Panama Papers, inquiry into financial misconduct in Australia, etc., right? So if something like that happens, then your response is you basically weed out the bad apples. So you want to take all the greedy people out, right? And then those that are remaining, want to re-educate them in character and values training, right? So see how that assumption and that model flows onto, therefore, if the theory is correct, then the response is this. Problem is, like I said, doesn't work, okay? And the weird part about it is that even though it doesn't work, and even though there's lots and lots of evidence to show it doesn't work, we, as in the regulators, people running corporations, even government, that sort of stuff, basically keep barreling down the same path of trying to do the same thing. So ethical dilemma, okay, weed out bad apples, right, re-educate those that remain. That quote, what is it? Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. Well, this is insanity. And as I said, that's kind of where I got to about, where are we, sort of 10 years ago, but basically questioning whether or not we're doing, in terms of teaching ethics, made a difference. And of course, as I said, that did not impress the ethics professors at all. They were quite upset with me proposing that what we're doing doesn't make any difference. And I also had the other thing that kind of drove me into action around this issue was I had my personal challenge around this as well. So I'll tell you what happened to me. So if I go back to 2003, I think, 2003, 2004. So basically 2003, 2004, I'd written a few books. The 3 books, Be, Do and Faith, which you may have come across, had been picked up by Penguin, translated into 11 different languages, sold around the world. And so obviously there was a lot of, I suppose, kudos and attention coming to me. I was on radio, television, etc., telling people, how to fix their lives, etc. Anyway, so about the same time, I had spent quite a bit of time in South Africa, and an opportunity came up to go over to South Africa and take up the lease on this amazing, breathtaking 500-acre property bordering the Drakensberg mountain ranges. And so it was one of those dreams that I had of creating a space where people could, take some time out and think about, the deeper issues of life. Anyway, what happened was, soon after arriving there, the property became the subject of a land claim. And the land claim was pretty nasty. Like the people that were involved in it started getting pretty nasty. Like we were being threatened, our staff were being threatened, fences were being cut, we were being robbed, we were being robbed, etc., these sorts of things. Anyway, and it went on for a period of time. So it was one of those, frog in the boiling pot sort of scenarios where I suppose my well-being, the well-being of my family was getting worse and worse. And so finally we found the right person at the, I think it was Department of Land, whatever, who was supposed to be resolving these sorts of issues. We went and saw them up in Joburg and explained the situation. And I remember the guy saying, "Oh, yeah, know all about that situation, know the people involved." And we said, "Okay, great, come and sort it out." And he said, "No way," because last time that he'd been down there and tried to sort it out, his life had been threatened. So we said, "What are we supposed to do?" And he said, "Okay, we have 3 choices. Either one, do nothing, in which case your business is going to fail because, like I said, we couldn't get people to work there, etc., being stolen from, etc. 2, you can take legal action to resolve, which will take 6 months and cost you about R500,000, and put your life and the life of your family in grave danger because, if you're basically pushing to resolve it, some of the African ways of resolving things can be pretty brutal. Or 3, you can leave." So one of the people who were involved who had an interest in the property, financial interest in the property, interest in selling it, he got involved with a security organisation which was based on, what do they say? They sort out security issues in the same way that local people do. Anyway. So I said to him, "Well, before you do anything, can I have a meeting with you and find out what you're actually going to do?" So I remember meeting with this guy at the local town it was actually in the beer garden, I suppose. And after pestering this guy over and over again about what you're going to do, because I said, "What are you going to do?" He said, what did he say? The less you know, the better, effectively. And anyway, pester. And eventually he sort of rocked back in his chair and he said, "Ahmed, we're going to kill him, of course." As in kill the person who was causing all the problems with regard to the land claims. And so for a milli-fraction of a second, I contemplated, all I had to do is go, "Yep, okay, no worries, do it," and walk away, and it would have been done, right? Which shocked me that even, as I said, for a tiny sort of millisecond, I could consider actually having somebody killed. And so hence the whole thing of far out. What drives us to this position where, as a good person, we would consider to do a bad thing? And so my PhD research, as I said, changed to focus on that question. Right. So the first thing, like I said, came to, as I said to you a minute ago, is that my proposition was that the theory was actually flawed. So reality, what's the reality check on that? So theory is we go through those steps, and as I said, if you sit in a workshop, as I do sit in workshops, and ask people, "Is this the way you make ethical decisions?" Pretty much everybody will go, "Yep, that's exactly how I make ethical decisions." But as I said, reality doesn't reflect that. So reality is that psychopaths have the same capacity for ethical decision making as everyone else. The problem is they just don't care. So in other words, if you take, so remember in the last podcast we went through that little ethics test with those 10 questions. You can take a psychopath and ask them the same questions, they'll give you the same answer. And the common trait, so the common trait with the dark triad, so the dark triad is sociopathy or psychopathy, however you say it. Machiavellianism and narcissism, so that's the dark triad. And the common trait across the dark triad is callousness or a complete lack of empathy. So in other words, that people don't care. All right, so that's reality. So what I did is I looked at the interdisciplinary research. So I said, okay, so if the business ethics, because of my PhD was in the Faculty of Business, and so I was looking at moral philosophy and that sort of stuff. But if the business research was basically fixed on that thinking and the theory did not work, then what was actually going on? So I looked at interdisciplinary research. So the first area I looked at is, actually, back up a minute. Let's rewind a sec. So the first question that you need to answer is, all right, so what's the distinction between a good person and a bad person? So how do you define good person, bad person? Because it's very subjective. And obviously for to submit a PhD, so a PhD thesis, I had to actually define the terms, right? And so let me just take you through this because it's important. So remember that some of the writings, if you like, in moral philosophy that I've drawn on and touched on are Aristotle's work, Kant, and Bentham and Mill with utilitarian ethics. So basically, this is what they say if you go back and you, as I did, go back and read the original writings. So there's quite a bit. They wrote quite a lot about good people and bad people. So Aristotle. So to Aristotle, a good person is a person of virtuous character. So the key virtues are identified as courage, temperance, liberality, magnificence, honour, patience, amiability, and sincerity. All right? And so a good person doing bad things, according to Aristotle, is a person of virtuous character, being incontinent and acting from emotion rather than from rational thought. Okay, so acting from emotion rather than rational thought. And so remember, go back to the theory and remember some of the assumptions in the theory. So one of the key assumptions in the theory is that ethical decision making is a rational cognitive process. And what Aristotle's saying is that a good person doing a bad thing is someone who is acting from emotion rather than rational thought, all right? Now, a bad person doing bad things, according to Aristotle, is a person of non-virtuous character. So non-virtuous character acting in a licentious way, driven by their own emotional desires. Right? And so Aristotle's conclusion is that it is not always possible to think about things in the moment due to our emotional incontinence, and therefore we should habitually do virtuous acts until they become who we are. So see, Aristotle's right into the whole idea of like, excellence is basically a habit. Okay, so doing things habitually. All right, so Immanuel Kant. So Kant saw character as related to the will and the ability of the actor to act from the position of pure will and reason rather than desire. So see how we're covering the same sort of thing? So reason rather than desire. A good person, from a Kantian perspective, is a person who has a good frame of mind and a willingness to obey the imperative of morality regardless of the consequences. So see how, remember in the last one we were talking about a value is not a value unless you're willing to pay a price to uphold it. And my proposition was that the price that you pay to uphold the value would be some sort of desired outcome. So see how Kant's basically picking up on the same thing. So he's saying a willingness to obey the imperative of morality regardless of the consequences. And Kant goes on. So this is Kant 1785, if you're curious. So a good person is a person who is acting with a free and autonomous will in a rational way. Okay, so a free and autonomous will in a rational way. A good person doing a bad thing, according to Kant, is a person who believes they are acting with a free will but are in fact deluded. Their faculty of pure reason has been compromised by sensuous desire, and they are not acting as their genuine self. A good person doing a bad thing is therefore a self-deluded person driven by sensuous desires and the attachment to a certain outcome who has lost touch with their genuine self and is not truly free. A bad person doing bad things from a Kantian perspective is a person of weak or poor will, acting with a poor frame of mind, that is, with no intention to obey the imperative of morality and driven by sensuous desires and a preferred outcome. Jeremy Bentham, so remember Jeremy Bentham is a utilitarian. So as a utilitarian, you're focused on pleasure and pain, right? And actions should be judged on their consequences and the effect on utility. So a good person, according to Bentham, is simply then a person who is most likely to give rise to good outcomes. And in considering the notion of a good person doing bad things, Bentham considers motive, intention, and consciousness. So a good person doing a bad thing may be a person of poor consciousness doing a heedless act. A good person doing a bad thing may also be a person lacking bad intention, so not being aware of certain circumstances and making an error of judgment with regard to these circumstances. Got it? Okay, so, we should actually say John Stuart Mill. So John Stuart Mill, remember it was a little bit after Bentham, so around 1860s. So Mill takes the theory of utilitarian a little bit further down the path of universalism. And a good person, according to Mill, is a person who has nourished their higher or noble feelings and sense of dignity, right? So a good person will uphold the principles of impartiality, truthfulness, equality, and unity. And above all, will act in a way that reflects the principle that everybody has an equal right to happiness. Okay, so a good person doing a bad thing, of course, it's according to John Stuart Mill, could be a person who has lost touch with their inner moral compass and has used the power of intellect to justify why they are taking certain actions. So note this, because we're going to come back to this. So note the importance of how you justify it. Remember when we were talking about the idea of Robin Hood, and that the way that we justify Robin Hood's actions changes the meaning of that story, okay? So he goes on, so a good person doing bad things, therefore, could be a person with a weak will who has given in to desire and rationalized away the internal moral conflict, right? So basically, if we mash all these things, these definitions together, so the definition, this was my definition for my PhD thesis, right? So we consolidate it together. So a good person doing a bad thing is a person of good character, as defined by courage, temperance, liberality, magnificence, honor, patience, amiability, and sincerity. That's Aristotle stuff. Driven by emotion rather than rational thought, who has good intention and believes they are acting with a free will, but are in fact deluded because their faculty of pure reason has been compromised by sensuous desire, and they are not acting as their genuine self, and is violating the principles of impartiality, truthfulness, equality and unity, or empathy, whilst rationalizing away the internal moral conflict, so in other words, their will has given way to their desire, and creating an outcome that decreases the overall level of happiness. So there you go. So a bit long-winded, but essentially a good person doing a bad thing is a person of good character who's basically acting with good intent, but effectively is deluded and creating a bad outcome, right? All right, so let's look at the interdisciplinary research, right? So what does the research say? So social psych research, so remember the definition, remember the whole idea of delusion. See how this more, what would you call it? More modern or more recent research thinking about these areas, like basically validates what they're thinking about in Aristotle's case a couple of thousand years ago. So social psychology, so we suffer from self-serving cognitive biases that cause us to miss ethical issues due to perceptual blindness, right? So remember in that rational decision-making model, the first step is recognize the ethical dilemma. All right, so if you don't recognize it, you can't engage rational thought, okay? And what social psych says is, yes, there are issues where we don't even recognize the ethical dilemma. So the classic one is recently with the Hayne Royal Inquiry in Australia into the behaviour of financial institutions. A couple of them were caught charging dead people fees. And in the inquiry, they said, well, didn't you recognise this as a moral dilemma? And basically what they said is, no, we were treating it as a business issue and therefore we continue to charge them fees until we receive the death certificate and, tick that off. Right, so if you're applying the wrong decision-making schema to the issue, in other words, you don't recognise it as an ethical issue, obviously you don't go down the ethics path, you look at it from like a business perspective or something like that. Also, we overestimate our own ethical behaviour and we think we are more ethical than others. Well, of course, right? We rewrite history in our own favour, right? So we rewrite history in our own favour because we don't, remember that we don't want to think about ourselves as being bad, right? We change our self-concept according to circumstances. So we can be like one person at home, another person at work, another person on the sports field, something like that. So we change our self-concept. So our self-concept, this is from self-identity theory. So we have a story that we tell about ourselves, our self-concept. And as I said, according to circumstances, we change that story. Right, so we change that story. So all of us have multiple identities. And we overestimate dispositional factors and we underestimate contextual factors, okay? So what that means is that when we see ethical dilemmas or issues, right, we're looking at dispositional factors. So we're looking for somebody to blame. So there's something wrong with that person, it's their disposition, it's their character or their values or they're greedy or something. And we underestimate the impact of contextual factors, so what's happening in the bigger picture. The second area I looked at is criminology. Right, so in criminology, a lot of criminology is, I suppose, focused on deterrence theory. So deterrence theory basically says that, again, it's based on the assumption that, bad behaviour is rational and logical. Therefore, if we put in big deterrence, we tell people they're going to go to jail, pay a fine, something like that, then it's a rational, logical process, and therefore they won't do it. I would refute that strongly, and I think a better way of explaining this is what's called moral neutralization theory. Okay, so moral neutralization theory basically says, and this came out of research that was done in the 1950s in New York into delinquent youth in New York, and the theory was that those delinquent youth held antisocial values. But actually when they started researching it, they found that delinquent youth held exactly the same values as mainstream society, but they used these neutralizations basically to neutralize those values and allow them to do bad things without having to reassess themselves as being bad, okay? So basically what happens is the rational mind protects your self-identity. So if you have a self-identity where you're saying I'm a good person and for whatever reason you want to do a bad thing, have incentive to do a bad thing, then you rationalize that away using one of these rationalizations. And what's key is the concept of justice, right? So with these 7 rationalizations, the first one is denial of responsibility. So it's not my fault. So that's like the Nuremberg defense. So it's just following orders. It's not my fault. It's above my pay grade, whatever, those sorts of things. So we hear these things, these rationalizations or justifications often in life, but it's interesting to pay attention because basically what's happening is they're neutralizing the aspirational values. The second one is denial of injury. So it's not hurting anyone, what's your problem? So like graffiti, stealing from insider trading, etc. So it's not hurting anybody, what's your problem? The third one is denial of the victim, right? So you deny the victim's rights. So they deserved it. So for example, rich people deserve to be stolen from because they've got lots of things. The fourth one is condemnation of the condemners. and this is also, it's a stupid rule anyway. So the rationale is you think I'm bad, but you should see them, or as I said, it's a stupid rule anyway. So the simple one there would be, speeding, like late at night speeding in the car, stupid rule anyway. Why do I have to do 40 there? There's nobody around, etc. The fifth one is appeal to higher loyalties. So I did it for you, or I did it for my team, or I did it for my country, did it for my gang, whatever. Okay. The sixth one is everybody else is doing it, so I had no choice to follow suit. So that's like paying bribes in foreign countries, etc. And the last one, number 7, is claim to entitlement. So I deserve it. So I've been working, so hard over the last few months, working extra hours, so therefore I deserve to, pinch a cab charge voucher or get the corporation to pay for me to drive home or something like that, or get a taxi home, okay? The third area I looked at, which we've covered a bit of this already, so this is the neurocognitive science area. So this is asking the question of, okay, so in that blind state, so when you're perceptually blind, how are you actually making decisions? And remember the 2 interrelated processes. So systems 1, thinking subconscious pattern matching process, and systems 2, thinking a higher order reasoning cycle. And remember that higher order conscious reasoning uses about 4 times as much energy as subconscious pattern matching. So basically we default into subconscious pattern matching to save energy, so from a survival perspective. And the problem is that with ethical dilemmas, so basically we're just pattern matching, and basically what the research shows is that rational higher order decision making is normally not engaged until after the event, right? So after the event, and only in order to justify why we made the decision we did, right? So in other words, your rational mind acts more like a lawyer defending a client than a scientist objectively looking at the facts. And remember as well, if you think about like ethical dilemmas, basically what happens with ethical dilemmas is you see it. So the moment you see it, you pattern match, and often you make an emotive decision. So you instantaneously make a decision about it. And then somebody will come to you and say, why did you do that? Why did you make that decision? And then you go, well, I did it because blah, blah, blah. So you engage the rational mind after that. Okay, so the conclusion that I came to, like looking at these different areas, so looking at moral philosophy, existential philosophy, social psychology, criminology, and neurocognitive science, the conclusion I came to was basically the theory that we were using for ethical decision making was wrong. And so what I set out to do was to try and understand that question of why good people did bad things. So why do good people do bad things? And so what I did is I mashed together those different theories and put it into a causal factor model, because basically my proposal was that the bit of, remember going back to the Jones, the rational logical model, so you recognize the moral dilemma, you make a moral judgment, you set your moral intention, and then you act on it, okay? So my first point was, well, if you miss it, you miss the fact that it's an ethical dilemma, you don't have access to that process. And secondly, that the intention stuff should come first, not last, right? So we should be thinking about our intention first, not last. So I strive to develop a causal factor model, and I went and tested the causal factor model. If you want to see the causal factor model, so if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, I'll upload the PowerPoint slides. Well, I'll upload the video of this to the YouTube channel so you can see it, but also you can Google my work and look at the model. But basically, I'll walk you through the model. So what I said is that the first thing you should be looking at is personal, situational, and contextual factors. Okay, so remember, we're trying to understand why do good people do bad things. So these are good people that have good intentions, but basically unintentionally or non-deliberately create bad outcomes. So the first thing I said is there's personal factors that impact on their ability to self-regulate. Okay, so basically anything that stresses us is going to diminish our capacity to self-regulate. So health issues, financial issues, relationship stress, anything like that sleep deprivation, anything like that is going to diminish our capacity to self-regulate between systems 1 thinking and systems 2 thinking, right? So for fast and slow decisions, emotive decisions versus cognitive decisions. And obviously if you're pattern matching the whole time, you can pattern match or sort of create a mismatch, if you like, by things that have happened in the past, and that's going to create the ground to unintentionally create a bad outcome. There's also situational factors that impact on this. So situational factors could be, if you're working in an organisation, basically anything that's going to entice you to do bad behaviour. So anything that's going to entice you to strive towards a particular outcome and negate your values in the process. So things like, bonuses that are paid on how much business you write, etc. Obviously, that's going to encourage you to sort of churn and burn, anything like that. And then the third one, the bigger picture stuff, is contextual factors. So contextual factors is anything in the bigger environment that's going to create basically an environment of stress and incentive to make quick decisions, right? So obviously it's now 2022. In the last couple of years, we've been going through a global pandemic. So obviously a very big, stressful context, okay? So all of that is going to diminish your capacity to think rationally about this. And then what will come out of those three things is either a sense of moral obligation or a sense of moral entitlement. And I would suggest to you that that is the distinction between a good person and a bad person. So a good person has a sense of moral obligation. So it feels obliged to look after their children, their family, their friends, their organisation, their company, obliged to do the right thing, etc., etc. A bad person has a sense of moral entitlement, right? So they think they're entitled to, get their own way, use company resources for their own benefit, whatever, any of those sorts of things. And many of us have worked for narcissists and sociopaths and Machiavellians who do basically do that, okay? But that is my conclusion, is the distinction between good person and bad person. And by the way, I should add, so the process that I use to develop and refine this model is what's called reflective phenomenology. So effectively what you do is you put together a model which you think might explain behaviour, and then you find people that have gone through the instance. So I found people that had been convicted of, corporate crimes, so fraud, insider trading, etc., and also whistleblowers. And then I got them to reflect on the events that led up to that instance and basically walk through this model and see whether or not, and kept refining the model until it became predictive. Okay, so this is the final model. So out of the sense of moral obligation or moral entitlement, you have your moral intention. All right, so moral intention is an intention which is bound by aspirational values. But then what happens is a trigger event occurs. So a trigger event violates or threatens to violate the moral obligation. Right, so violates or threatens to violate the moral obligation. And then it triggers one of those moral neutralizations, because basically the reaction that the person has to whatever's happening is, oh my God, this is unfair. This is unfair or unjust, right? This is unfair or unjust. Therefore, I'm justified to take action to balance up the scales of justice. And my justification is one of those, remember those flawed justifications, 7 flawed justifications. So everybody else is doing it. It's a stupid rule anyway, etc., right? So what happens is the first time the person experiences this situation, they use higher order conscious reasoning to think about it, right? But they're not thinking about the issue in terms of one of those normative ethical theories. They're thinking about the issue from the perspective of fairness or justice. So what's fair or just? Okay, and as I said, they're justifying their actions using a flawed justification. So then that flows through and they make a decision, they go and do something, but then there'll be a justification trigger event. So somebody will say, why did you do that? And they won't be able to justify their decision using values or principles. They'll use one of those flawed justifications. But then what happens is, so remember, this is an existential model as well. So everything that happens affects what happens next. right? So that person has done a bad thing, they've used a flawed justification, right? But somewhere in the recesses of their mind, they still acknowledge the fact that, oh, maybe I shouldn't have done that, right? They recognize they do a slightly bad thing. So what happens is you get what's called cognitive dissonance. So you look yourself in the mirror and one part of you is going, yeah, I was justified in doing that. And the other part's going, no, that was a bad thing to do, okay? So you have this internal conflict going on. And then what happens is people get stuck in it because they suffer from self-righteousness. And they think, oh, it's just this one little thing, I can fix it. Right? It's just this one little thing, I can fix it. But then what happens is that cognitive dissonance, that internal dialogue, basically saying you've done a bad thing, feeds back into your personal well-being. And often at this point, what happens is people start self-medicating, right? Because you know you've done a bad thing. Shut up, little voice inside my head. So they start drinking, taking drugs, doing risky behaviour, etc., right? Which of course diminishes again their capacity for self-regulation. So then the next time you face the same situation, remember the brain doesn't want to revisit the decision it's already made. The brain does pattern matches. Oh, we've been through the situation before. Yep, pattern match against that. So what happens with these sorts of ethical dilemmas is they happen gradually and then suddenly. So for example, fraud. So often fraud will start off with something very small. And then, as I said, the person basically keeps pattern matching against the same decision the same decision-making process they've already done. So they keep perpetuating it more and more and more, and it gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And the common response from people that get, caught with fraud, caught out, busted, whatever you want to call it, is, oh, thank God it's over, right? Because they feel trapped in this ongoing cycle, okay? So that's my causal factor model. And as I said, if you're curious, you can look at that in more depth. If you're having problems sleeping, you can even download the thesis. If you go to QUT ePrints and Google me, you can read the whole 100,000 word thesis, right? But obviously the next question out of this, because this model is very good at predicting why good people do bad things. So you can look around the model and say, what were the triggers? But the next bit that happened out of this is I'd finished my PhD, and obviously the question was, okay, so if that explains why good people do bad things, then what? And that the majority of ethics and ethics education and training makes no difference. What could you do differently? Right? What could you do differently that might actually help to stop good people doing bad things? So that was what happened to me after I did my PhD. I had a postdoctoral research fellowship and looked at that. And so the summary of that, so good people do bad things due to a dynamic interplay of a number of factors, including personal, situational, and contextual factors, perception, self-delusion, and rationalizations. And so remember how we can go back to those teachings of Aristotle, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, Kant, who are basically picking up on some of these things around delusion, rationalization, etc. Okay. A pre-existing sense of moral obligation and a trigger event that threatens this obligation prompts a good person to take a bad action that they justify using rationalizations that neutralize their stated values. Okay. And the person's subjective view of justice impacts on this process, and once the decision has been made to take action to balance the scales of justice, a sense of self-righteousness holds people in the ongoing process of creating an ethical outcome. So the process becomes a slippery slope. All right, so what to do about it? So let's just look. So some of the key concepts here, and some of these concepts can be quite challenging, right? Because we like to believe. So remember, if you go back to ethical decision-making theory and the assumptions that underpin it. So the assumptions that underpin it is a rational cognitive process. So we like to believe that, the power of the rational mind, that we can make sense of the world, etc., etc. Right? But some of the key concepts that come out of this are much more, what would you call it? Ethereal, I think the word is. So let's just look at it. So one, human existence is inherently interpretive, right? So it's inherently interpretive. And this is really social constructivism theory. All right, so social constructivism theory says there's no objective reality, that we're creating our reality through the words and actions of the actors in the play, right? So in other words, we are all the actors and we're creating it. So it's inherently interpretive. We suffer from cognitive biases. Subjective perceptions of justice are key. The story people tell themselves about their current reality is a critical influencing factor in the creation of unethical outcomes, right? Because remember that if a person believes that what's going on is unfair or unjust, then they're going to be more likely to believe that they are justified to step in and balance up the scales of justice, okay? Unethical outcomes occur gradually and then suddenly, which I said a minute ago. It's not enough to simply be able to think about ethical dilemmas, right? It's not enough to be able to think about ethical dilemmas. So you need to look at that distinction between normative ethical theories and practical ethics, what actually happens. So what I did is I was asked, so with my thesis, so it said, okay, so if that's the model that explains why good people do bad things, then what is the normative ethical theory that underpins that, right? So what's the normative ethical theory that underpins it? So if it's the ought, so how ought I to live, right? How do I do these things, okay? And so the key is, so existing normative ethical theories are static and focus on values, character. Normative ethical theories are static, focused on values, character, virtues, and outcomes. However, the nature of reality is that everything changes, and the ethical decision-making process is a small part of the overall process of the creation of unethical outcomes. So what I came up with is what's called moral intention theory. So moral intention theory is a dynamic theory that proposes that the key to the creation of ethical outcomes and the minimization of unethical outcomes is the ability to define, enact, and protect moral intentions. So moral intention is defined as the ability to prioritize moral values over other values, and hence requires that the desired outcome is bound by moral values. And protecting moral intention is the act of protecting the values from being neutralized by flawed justifications. So remember those flawed justifications. So if you think about graphically, and again, you can look at the graphic on the YouTube video if you like, but basically if you think about three circles, so the outer circle is all possible actions, then the circle inside that is moral boundaries, so set by intrinsic values like freedom, honour, patience, truth, impartiality, etc. Right? And then you have a smaller circle, which is the intended action. So the intended action might be motivated by desires such as profit, achievement, etc. So if the circle of the intended action is inside the moral boundaries, then the moral intent is intact. If, however, the circle of the intended action is outside of the moral boundaries, then the moral intention has been broken, okay? So moral intention theory proposes that the central concern of a person wishing to avoid the creation of unethical outcomes should be a focus on their moral intentions. And the secondary concern should be on defining their moral boundaries, protecting their free will, and ensuring outcomes are considered from the perspective of whether or not they are aligned to stated intentions. So the ideal is to achieve existential alignment between intentions, actions, and the stories told about the outcome. So see how this relates back to that past, present, future model, past, present, future, existentialism, and the whole idea of trying to line up your aspirational being with your free being and the story that you're telling about it, right? So from a ethics perspective, so moral intention, so what do you want to do? You want to define, enact, and protect moral intent, right? So the defining moral intent is the future-based stuff. So what are you intending to create? What are those values you're intending to live by? And then enacting it is in the present moment, so taking action that's aligned to that. And then protecting moral intent is protecting it from those flawed justifications. Okay. So that is the summary of why good people do bad things. And yeah, that's a very different way of looking at the whole issue of ethics than some of these older normative ethical theories. And so given that, that's the model, so given that what you're trying to do is define and act and protect moral intent, there's critical things that you need to do in each of those realms. So obviously, with regard to intentions, you need to spend a bit of time defining it. So what are you trying to create? So what are you trying to create, and what are the values or principles that are going to define your behaviour and define your moral intent? And then, as I said, making sure that you're actioning that in alignment to that and then protecting it. So when you're protecting moral intent, it comes down to being very able and willing to, I suppose, question people's justifications, including your own, and to make sure that the way that you're justifying events is aligned to the values that you are trying to create or enact in the world. All right, I might leave it there. Thank you very much for listening. So again, feel free to connect on Facebook or LinkedIn, and also the Thinkific site has the courses there on the Thinkific site. And if you're watching this on Apple Podcasts, if you're listening to this on the Apple Podcast, take a moment to do a review. Thank you very much, and bye for now.